They were torn from the land that was nurtured for them. They stood by while strangers and friends bought their souls and what was theirs for many a year was in minutes torn from their hands. From riches to rags, their heritage divided among many. So let's mourn for their grief and cry for their loss, forever torn from the land.
Thomas Jefferson once stated that the widely dispersed ownership of land by the tiller is the American safeguard for democracy. And small landowners are the most precious parts of a state. And in the 1860s, 80% of the population lived in rural areas. About 4 million farms existed in the United States, and most of those were family farms. The farming peak was in 1935, when approximately 6.8 million farms dotted the United States. With the advancement of technology, life for the farmer became easier. For example, in the early 1800s, it took about 373 hours to produce 100 bushels of wheat, while in 1959, the same task is performed in about 18 hours. This increase in production was heavily due to new machinery, fuel, fertilizer, and many other chemicals. But these costs are expensive, and with their introduction there came the need for a significant increase in capital investment. This in turn created new guidelines for operating credit during the growth cycle. In the 1970s, the farmer was told to plant from fence row to fence row. He was told to get big or get out. He was told to quit repairing old equipment and buy new. He was told to buy and clear more and more land. And the farm credit system was right there, ready to approve new and bigger loans. The American farmer trusted in their creditors as they have for many years. They trusted that they were doing what was right for their farms and what was right for America. They were told they could feed the whole world. Production was up. Profits were up. Land values were up. Times were good. When suddenly, in the early 1980s, the mood sharply changed. A drought hit in 1981 and land values dropped, while interest rates soared and crop prices fizzled to all-time lows. And then, in 1985, the current budget director, David Stockman, stated that the farm problem was a result of too many farms. This attitude was a slap in the face to the American farmer, because for the first time in the history of our nation, the current political and economical belief was for the dispossession of thousands of farm families, all under the guise of good economics. How can this be? How can we be allowing the rural way of life to be systematically destroyed? Farmers are being torn from their land. Loans are being accelerated and called due. Those very same farms are being resold at half the original mortgage value with less interest payment. If the farmer had been offered that deal, he could have kept the farm that belonged to his family for generations. Why are we allowing the death of the American farmer? Now these very same loan officers that once nearly demanded the farmer take out these large loans are calling that farmer a poor manager for taking out loans the loan officers told him to. Does the farmer control interest rates? Does the farmer control land values? Does the farmer control crop prices? The answer to all of these questions is no. And if the farmer can't control these factors, then how can the farmer be told to accept the blame for his own demise? The death of the American farmer is not the fault of the American farmer, and this genocide must be stopped.
It's not a farm problem, it's a national problem. It's a problem with all of America, and it affects every person that's living in this country. And when they take control of the production of food, they will be able to control people. And this is what it's all about, is being able to control people.
What is 26,000, 30,000, I'll be able to give 30, I'm going to only take it about to give 30,000. God is taking about to give 30.
Herb Green stands by with his wife and daughter as the land that has been in his family for generations is auctioned off. He's 66 years old and has farmed this land all of his life. In fact, he was plowing this very same field back in December of '41 when the news came that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. Herb signed up with the Army right away and was sent to the South Pacific in one of the first drafts.
Yeah, I risked my life for my own country. That's the reason I went. If the country ain't worth fighting for, it ain't worth living in.
And so for 4 straight years, Herb fought his way through the South Pacific. He rushed pillboxes, dug into foxholes, did what he could to push the Japanese further and further back. Herb was fighting for America. He was fighting for the protection of democracy and for the freedom of all people. America had called him, and he answered that call without hesitation by putting his own life on the line.
Never had a 3-day pass or a furlough in 4 years. I was at Hermashima where they dropped the atomic bomb. I was all over it. Yeah, I've served my country, and I think I can stand up and say I'm proud of it. And I've raised food for this country all my life. But that wasn't the answer, I guess. I'm selling everything now because I can't make it pay off.
Here's a man who's given his life to America, and yet today, all he has to show for it is a flooded homestead and some rusted old equipment. All of his land and any worthwhile equipment has been sold, with the proceeds going to lending institutions. And why? Because Herb Green couldn't get a fair price for his crops. It's just that simple.
Well, what's going on? America is selling out America. We're bringing everybody else in here and giving them all a head start. It's like this. I fought Japan with a gun. Now they come back here and whipped us with a pencil. Of course, I'm going to be 66 this year. And they don't want to hire anybody at that age. It's pretty hard to get a job when you get my age.
At a time in his life when he should be considering retirement, instead, he finds himself with barely anything to call his own. And yet Herb Green gave the best years of his life to his country.
Whose fault was it that the farmer's losing the farm? Is it his fault? Quite to the contrary. It's the fault of the people who brought about the inflation and then the deflation to intentionally take away the farmer's farm, because when you control food, you control the people of a nation. It's not the fault of the farmer that he's losing his farm. It's the fault of the people who intentionally, by design plan, are stealing the farms of America for the purpose of being able to control the food and the people and the farmers. Now, the people in the city think they're all right now. But wait 2 to 5 years from now when it shows up at the grocery store shelf and prices go sky high and food is lacking, and then they'll know that the same people that control the farmer and stole his farm is likewise controlling the city person now.
On the one hand, you've got the analysis that talks about adjustment. On the other hand, you've got the analysis that talks about genocide and destroying not only the rural way of life, the family farmers, but also total rural communities. Because presently there's one farm going under every 6 minutes. And for every 5 to 7 farms that goes under, a business on Main Street goes under. So we'll see an increasing number of ghost towns across rural America. And we're seeing this happen in the heartland of America now.
Streets that were once bustling with heavy traffic on a busy Saturday morning now lay quiet. Sidewalks that were once pounded by the feet of shoppers are now overgrown with weeds and litter. Storefronts that were once made attractive for the buyers are now bolted and locked up. And the rural community, as we once knew it, is dying. Small towns that dot the Midwest farming belt are literally turning to dust. These towns depended upon the farmer's dollar, and the farmer has no dollars to spend. And with the farmers hurting and rural business and communities hurting, the banking industry is also hurting. For over the past 4 years, over 380 banks in this country have been declared insolvent. So if the farmer is allowed to die, much more than just his farm will die with him.
The government program they've come out with is not helping the farmer. We're forced into a situation where we need the government payments to survive, but that is not helping us. It is putting us further under the control of the government. It's putting us further under the control of lending institutions. It is putting the farmer in a position where he is not working for himself, he is working for the banks.
So the local banker, don't always blame him for your problems. It goes back further than the local banker. In fact, it goes all the way back to 1913. The week before Christmas, most congressmen had gone home. They had made sure that just enough stayed in Washington to pass what they wanted to pass in the form of the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve Act gave a private entity the power over the American dollar. Now, that year, Mr. Lindbergh, the father of the great aviator, who had flown his aircraft successfully so much around the world, he was the head of the banking committee of the House of Representatives and was so disturbed over what was happening because he knew the issues involved in the Federal Reserve until he wrote a book warning the American people that the Federal Reserve could be the destruction of our economy. But no one listened to him, and the Federal Reserve Act went through, and very few people thought much about it until the American dollar started going haywire. And then what do we find out that the Federal Reserve really is? Some have investigated it, and have found out that the Federal Reserve is really not an agency of the federal government at all. The Federal Reserve is a privately owned corporation, and the people who own the majority of the stock in the regional banks of the Federal Reserve control the currency of America. Who are those individuals? Well, in our research, we found out that over 1/2 of them, owners of the Federal Reserve, are not even citizens of the United States of America. Yet they control the interest and the general welfare of our country financially. So, who is destroying the farmer? It goes much further back than the local bank. It goes back to who controls the interest rate? The Federal Reserve. Who controls inflation? The Federal Reserve. Who controls the dollar in relation to foreign currencies? The Federal Reserve.
America is we're going to wind up with land in the hands of a few. It'll be probably corporations, and when they get that, then America is going to know what hunger is, because those people are going to, whenever that comes to that, they're going to sit down and they're going to tell you how much food they're going to produce at what price, and either you pay it or you don't.
If our government can bail out Chrysler Corporation and can save Continental Bank in Chicago, bail out New York City, why can they not save the family farms and the agricultural industry of this nation?
I've got 4 children, and I don't think one of them would want to take over the farm. My oldest one, my boy, he tried farming once, and he had to sell out and quit. He couldn't make a profit enough to pay his bills off. That's what I think it's going to do if something don't change.
I was in Canada just recently, and the man who was sponsoring the meeting, his son was a car dealership owner. And I asked him, I said, what does an American car sell for in Canada? Oh, he said, let's take a $20,000 American car, would cost $30,000 in Canada. I said, why? He said, because of the American dollar in relation to the Canadian currency. Now, when I went to Canada, I got $1.40 of Canadian currency for $1 of United States dollar in relation to the United States dollar. Well, what does that mean? That means that foreigners cannot buy American products because the Federal Reserve has determined on the world market that the American dollar is worth so much more in value compared to foreign currencies. But we can afford to buy foreign products. They took our electronic industry and moved it off to some foreign country. They took our automobile industry and moved it off to Japan. When you buy a product anymore, what do you find said on the product? Made in Hong Kong, made in Korea, made in Japan. Where are the days we said made in America? So what's happening to the farmer? He can't sell his products abroad. Who determined that the farmer couldn't sell his products abroad? Who controls the American dollar in relation to foreign currencies? The Federal Reserve.
The European common market countries, the French in particular, they subsidize their grain. Their farmers are getting over $5 a bushel, while ours are getting here $2 a bushel here in the United States. And they make up the difference. They make certain that their grain sells in the world market while our U.S. farmers, his grain does not sell, and we're sitting here holding the huge surpluses. We've even got the U.S. government subsidizing Argentina's sales overseas. Gave them a $300 million loan this spring so that they would be able to reduce the price that they would sell their products in the world market.
For the first time ever, the United States is importing more grain than we're exporting. The storage bins in this country are overflowing with surplus grain, grain that is rotting, and yet the United States is importing more grain. We keep hearing that foreign grain is less expensive than U.S. grain. We keep hearing it's to protect consumer prices. But the price of a loaf of bread at the grocery store hasn't decreased, even though we know the price of grain has. Over 60% of the consumers polled stated they would be willing to pay 4 cents more for a loaf of bread so the farmer could get a fair price. And yet the farmer can't even pay for his costs. When asked why America didn't buy England's raw material at a cheaper price, a famous politician replied quite simply by saying, if we buy England's raw material, then England will have America's money and America will have a finished product. But if we buy American raw material, then America will have the money and the product. It's true the world is becoming a fast-paced agricultural market, and countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Australia, and even China are producing more food than anyone ever thought possible. And U.S. grain export markets are receiving heavy competition. But to import grain with such a surplus doesn't make much sense. Some people say that foreign countries, such as Argentina, owe the United States banks so much money that the only way they can repay just the interest on those loans is by selling their wheat in our markets. Is it fair to allow the American public to repay Argentine loans while the American farmer and the rural way of life are destroyed in the process?
They've got nowhere to turn, no place to go. The chain has been broken, their heritage destroyed forevermore. When year after year they planted their soil, asking only to serve. They were called by the land, they felt chosen to farm, and a bond was formed with the land. But now there's nowhere to turn and no place to go. Oh, why are we allowing the family farm to die? They trusted in men and in government too, to help them care for but their trust was betrayed and their spirits were sold, leaving God's caretakers with nowhere to turn and no place to go. Oh, we will soon be sorry that the family farm has died.
The Federal Reserve is not an agency of the federal government. Let's prove that. Do federal agencies pay taxes on their property? No. Civil service and others. And who's under civil service? Government employees, are they not? But yet you go to property that's owned by the Federal Reserve, they pay taxes on it locally. Are there employees under civil service? Federal Reserve is not under civil service. Well, are they really a federal agency? No, privately owned. People who own the majority of the stock in the regional banks. Then who controls the Federal Reserve? Does Congress? No. Do the American people ever vote to do anything about the Federal Reserve? No. Why? Formed in 1913 as a private entity to control the interest and the currency of America through the control of the Federal Reserve. Now let's go back to what the Federal Reserve has done to the farmer. What did they do to the farmer's crops? Well, inflation and deflation, all controlled by those who manipulate the currency through the Federal Reserve and the foreign markets. What's happened? 3 years ago, a farmer said to me, my corn was worth over $3 a bushel. Well, I said, how much was your corn worth 2 years ago? Well, he said $1.75 a bushel. Well, how much is your corn going to be worth this year? $1.25 a bushel. Well, how much does it cost you to raise that corn? $1.60 a bushel. Well, I said, how much are you projecting to get from your corn next year? He said maybe 75 cents to $1 a bushel. And I said, you tell me that you're going to plant again? He said, well, what else can I do? This is all I've ever done all my life. It's a family farm. This is a lifestyle. What else can I do? I don't know anything else. I'll just keep on planting and hope that I'll get a price for my product. So the farmer's going broke. Do you blame the farmer? Who controls the price he gets for his product? The people who control the currency of America. Who does that? Remember, over 1/2 of the owners of the Federal Reserve stock in the regional banks are not even citizens of the United States of America. So who's controlling the price of the farmer's products, and who controls the interest rate that the farmer pays to the local bank? Not the local banker, but the Federal Reserve sets the prime rate. So in basics, where is the problem? As we said, don't sweep down the cobwebs. Let's get back to the spider. And when you kill the spider, you'll not have to worry with the cobwebs anymore.
It was like a funeral. Cars driving in with their lights on, lining up along the roadside, and men gathering together, muttering quietly to one another on a cold, gray, foggy morning. It looked as though the day was refusing to begin because it knew that today there would be a funeral, and everything that Hal Brewer had ever worked for would be laid to rest.
It's a good truck, you'll be proud of it. You can just rip Hal's name off and put yours on it.
The auctioneer sat in his nice warm trailer, totally oblivious to the pain the Brewers must be feeling, interested only in selling off all they owned. As the tractor pulled the trailer along its predestined path, it left in its wake all of Hal's machines, equipment, and tools in someone else's hands. Hal couldn't stand the pain of watching all he had ever wanted and owned being sold off. He didn't want to see his friends and neighbors, and he didn't want to hear the comments of strangers. Maybe his equipment wasn't the best money could buy, but each and every piece held special memories for Hal. And now those memories were being sold right along with the machinery, and Hal simply couldn't stand it. So he stayed home. But their home is less than half a block away, and I'm sure even within those four walls, Hal can still hear the wail of the auctioneer. Hal's wife Jackie came to the auction. She couldn't stand just sitting at home, waiting and waiting. Much of their equipment went for only pennies of what it originally cost them. And with each wave of the auctioneer's cane came a new hope that maybe this piece will be sold for what it's worth. One of the saddest parts of this auction is that the Brewers don't even know if the total sale will clear their debt. They may still owe, even after all this. Ironically, Hal was one of the largest vegetable farmers in the state of Arkansas, but with the current farm philosophy, even he couldn't make things work. So as the auctioneer continues with his pleas and Hal Brewer hides within his home, the soul of one more family farmer is divvied up to the highest bidders.
All done, sold it. $300 right here, number 76. Same way, 76. Thank you, sir.
I've got a son now that wants to be a farmer, 23 years old. And I tell him that his mother and I could give him our land, our equipment. It wouldn't be 3 years till he'd lose it all. The fact is that we're about to lose it, and we don't owe anybody anything right now. But still, we can see the end of coming because you just can't continue operating at a loss. But if he can't be a farmer, then his children will not be able to farm. The chain will be broken. You know, we're in America where we can do as we please, we think. But all of that's quickly coming to an end if we don't change what they're doing to us.
Take away, and that is the truth, the honesty, the integrity, our love for our country, our love for our God, and our self-worth and our self-concept. They are not going to do it.
Mona Lee became a counselor for the Farm Aid Hotline in Oklahoma, but she continues her fight alone because the man who stood by her side all those years left this world. And for the first time since their fight began, F.M. Brock is resting peacefully. But right before F.M. died, he told his wife to never stop fighting for the farmer because to give up would be like giving up on America. So Mona Lee spends her days and nights fulfilling her husband's last wish. She quietly hides her own pain deep within her and spends her energies trying to ease the pain of others.
And when farmers look at me and tell me, they will say, Mona Lee, I'm going to tell you something. I have a problem. I've never heard the name of this farmer before in my life. And in all likelihood, I will never meet him this side of heaven. But he will say, I have a story to tell you, and you won't believe it. Oh, yes, I will believe it, because I have lived through this, and these stories that these farmers tell that are so horrifying and so hard and so unbelievable is the truth, because that farmer does not lie.
In order to show what's happening to the farmer, let me use a $1 bill and a silver dollar. Now, on the top of the $1 bill, it says Federal Reserve Note. First of all, is it federal? No. Secondly, is it reserve? No, there's no reserve on there anyplace. And is it really a note? Now, according to Webster's dictionary, in order for something to be a legal note, it must have an amount on it somewhere to pay in something. Is there anywhere on that dollar bill that it says it'll pay in any amount of anything? No. Did there used to be a promise to pay on that dollar bill? Yes. What did it at one time promise to pay in? Gold or silver? Does it promise to pay in anything today? No. Then is it a legal note? No. Is it money? What is it? If it's not money, it's a green stamp, as I like to call it. Now let's take this silver dollar. And you'll remember that there was a time when you could take this $1 bill into a bank and get one of the silver dollars. Can you today? No, it'll take approximately 15 of these to get one of these. Then what changed in purchasing power? The green stamp or the silver dollar? The silver dollar today will still purchase what it would purchase 20 years ago. What will this purchase today? Approximately 13 cents of what it would purchase 20 years ago. So what did they do to the American farmer? They loaned him money in this purchasing power. Now notice the words purchasing power. What has changed purchasing power, this or this? The silver dollar is still worth the same purchasing power today it was 20 years ago. What changed purchasing power? The farmer was loaned money at this purchasing power. You remember the price of his land? $3,000 an acre. Inflation was going wild, and the farmer was told to buy more. So they loaned him bank interest at this purchasing power. Then his land is now worth $700 an acre. What's the purchasing power now of that land? Here is its value. The farmer borrowed money at this purchasing power, was requested to pay back at this purchasing power. Can he? Total impossibility. You can't do it. Let's take an illustration of 30 years ago. A person who had $30,000. They could have bought three two-bedroom, one-bath houses, could they not? Today, that same individual has $30,000 in a local lending institution getting interest. How many two-bedroom, one-bath houses can they buy with that $30,000 today? Approximately one half of one. Then what did the power brokers of money do? They changed the purchasing power of that person's money in the lending institution. What did they do? They robbed them of approximately 2/3 of its purchasing power. They've done the identical same thing to the farmer. Now we say it's the farmer's fault that he's broke. Quite to the contrary. The farmer is not at fault for being broke at all. It's the fault of the people who stole the purchasing power of the money from the farmer, loaned him at this rate, asked him to pay back at this rate, knowing all the time that they would get the farm for the price of the combine in 5 years.
The fall of '80, then they wrote me up then for having a baby without prior approval. Me and my wife, they said I took the bills in December, turned over to them. They said unauthorized expenditure, you didn't get prior approval first. Then in '81, then they wrote me up in fall '81 for having a heart attack. They said they said they could foreclose on me now because they warned me in '80 not to create an additional medical expense, and I overspent. They said they'd allowed me $500 medical bills. I guess some of the things farmers home would do. Well, it makes you feel fighting mad. At the time, they had already browbeaten me down so much I didn't know what to do. It makes you consider suicide or anything else. It makes you want to throw up your hands and quit. They beat me down until I felt I was second class and wasn't worth living. They made me feel like I was, subhuman. But this is just some of the stuff they run me through. Like I say, what they done to me, not so bad, but to watch your family suffer, do without. And with things they done, trying to live on what amounts to about $4,000 a year, and they tell you that's adequate. I jumped in for more money. He said, well, sign up for welfare. Are you eligible for it? I said, you want me farming 600 acres of land to go sign up for welfare? I'm supposed to be paying taxes, not spending the taxpayers' money. He said, no, you're farming for us.
As we saw back in the Great Depression, it's agriculture really that led the way into the Great Depression. A lot of people think it was a stock market crash, and that's what brought it all about. But if you get back and review it, you find that agriculture actually went into the Depression back in 26 and 27, and that drug down the rest of the economy because of the huge impact that farmers and agriculture in general has on the rest of the economy. So the danger to the rest of the economy with agriculture being in bad shape is just as great today as it was back before the Great Depression.
Usury, quite a subject. Usury is exorbitant interest that's charged to people. The system wants to keep people into a usury situation. After all, it's a vicious cycle where there is no end. And once you get into it, the wealth that you're gaining by your labor is stolen. Usury is condemned in the Bible. God made it very plain that the land of Palestine was not to be involved in usury. God's people in the Old Testament were not to be involved in usury. And usury has brought about the destruction of the American farmer. Because once they get them into a usury or interest system, whereby the interest goes so high until the farmer is paying back more in interest than what they can make on their crops, then they can confiscate the farm and get it without paying 1 penny for it. And a good example of that was the Bedford National Bank. My wife and I heard about this, and we decided that we would go to Bedford and see if we could investigate the issue. And I picked this up from the newsstand in the Bedford, Iowa, a little bitty country town down in southwestern Iowa. And it's the Bedford Times, and it says across the front, FDIC possesses 150 bank loans. Then it goes on to say, Army closes Bedford National Bank. Now this story could be multiplied many times all across America. It's nothing unusual. It's happening continuously. And the story was that the FDIC came into Bedford and said, the bank is not solvent. Now that might not necessarily be so. And in order to prove that it's not so is a person who called in on a radio talk show where I was in Dallas, Texas just a few weeks ago, and she announced that she was the wife of an agent of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And her husband had just called her on the phone a few hours earlier and said that they were closing down a bank that was not broke. It was solvent and in good condition, but the FDIC had ordered it closed. And in the course of the conversation, she said that they had a schedule of bank closures from then all the way up till a few months later, and that they were closing banks that, as far as he could determine by looking at the books, were completely solvent. And not only that, but she said that her husband had found out, since he went to work for the FDIC a year ago, that they are not a federal agency, that they are a privately owned corporation. And she said this over the air to approximately 3 million people. So the Bedford National Bank might not necessarily have been broke. In fact, some of the people in the town told me that they knew from reliable sources that the bank was quite solvent. But what did the FDIC do? They came in, announced that the bank was insolvent, closed it, then demanded payment from 150 loans. Now, the time on this is May the 7th, 1986. What time of the year does a farmer normally sell his crops? September, October, November, December? Well, it would be right interesting, wouldn't it, to demand payment on 150 farms in May when the farmer has no money? But you do know in the fine print that it states that if a bank closes, goes broke and closes, that the lending institution or the guaranteeing institution, the FDIC, has a right to demand payment on those notes within X number of days if they wish. So they demanded payment of 150 notes in that area, most of which were farmers, and they couldn't pay. How are they going to pay? So what happens to the farmer? He loses his farm. Why? Because he couldn't pay a lump sum. So what happened to the area of Bedford, Iowa? Well, it's a horror story that could be multiplied all over America, and was multiplied in Denver, Colorado not too long ago. And I dare to say that the majority of Americans don't know about this. I just happened to be in Denver at the time and picked this up off of the newsstand, the Denver Post, and it says, U.S. stings 156 Colorado banks. Did you know that 156 Colorado banks closed down one Friday afternoon? And many of them were not scheduled to open up on Monday morning? No. The American public didn't know that. Why not? Because for the next 2 weeks, after I was in Denver and picked this up off the newsstand, I was in 3 adjacent states to Colorado, and nobody knew anything about this. Why? There appeared to be a media blackout.
50 years from now, how will historians record the times of today? Will the unemployment figures and poverty levels hide the faces of those who are suffering? Will historians merely record the fact that over the past 5 years, over 250 banks collapsed in the United States? Or can the faces of those affected also be recorded? Will statisticians merely state that by the year 2000, 1 million American farms went under? Or will the grief-stricken faces of those who lived and worked the land for generations also be embedded in the history books? Will the records tell the story of 20 million Americans who are hungry today? Or will it merely state that over 15 national studies have concluded that hunger exists in America and in epidemic proportions? Will the archives tell the surplus story? Can the written word explain that while millions go hungry, the grain elevators in this great nation are overflowing and much of the surplus stored will rot before it's used? And while the grain is rotting, taxpayers, some of whom are hungry, are paying over $2 million a day to store this surplus. Will the history books be able to explain this irony? And what about the children? Who will survive to read these books? The children whose fathers were farmers, the children who traveled with their parents from mission to mission in search of food and shelter. How will these hardships affect them? And how will they remember the troubled times of today? Will it be the same? Before this program is over, 5 more family farms will disappear from America's heartland. Farms that have belonged to these families for generations. Why? Because the price for U.S. farm products has been driven so low that those farmers who do put a crop in the ground can't sell that crop and break even. The American family farmer is becoming an endangered species. And current government policy is allowing it to happen by designing farm subsidies that help large corporate farms and do little to help the family farm, those who are truly suffering. Farmers who have never missed a payment are receiving loan acceleration notices and being forced to either pay up or sell out. And for every 5 to 6 farms that go under, a business within that community is forced to shut its doors because the farmers spent a lot of money in town. And without the farmer's dollar, these communities don't function. And while the heartland of America is hurting, our government is subsidizing foreign farmers. History has proven the importance of agriculture to our nation. It was the farm crisis of the late 20s that led the way into the Great Depression of the 30s, and many say the farm crisis of today is much worse than it was then. The American family farm is dying a slow death, and we're allowing it to happen.
I was born in America. I'm proud to be an American. I plan to stay in America. When we pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States, what do we say? Do we say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the democracy for which it stands? Not on your life. We say, and to the republic for which it stands. Why? People under a republic cannot be made slaves. People under a democracy can be. Why? Because a democracy is run by a bureaucracy. Ask the average politician what America is. What do they say? A republic or a democracy? Invariably, they'll say a democracy. Why? Because that's what we've been changed to be, in order that we can be controlled. But what were we and what were we given by the Founding Fathers? We were given a constitutional republic. The two are as far separated from each other as east is from west. People oftentimes ask me, don't you believe in obeying government? I said, I sure do. Which one? After all, we have 2 forms of government in America today, not one. We have a constitutional republic given us by the Founding Fathers, in which they gave us the great American dream. We have a democracy which has seduced our constitutional republic, which is run by a bureaucracy, is soon to turn into a mobocracy, and has made us we the sheeple instead of we the people. But I think it's time to get back to a constitutional republic and say, I will not be a slave.
They were torn from the land that was nurtured for them. They stood by while strangers and friends bought their souls, and what was theirs for many a year was in minutes torn from their hands. From riches to rags, their heritage divided among many. So let's mourn for their grief and cry for their loss, forever torn from the land.
In 1973, I was the typical head-in-the-sand preacher, as I call myself, on the back cover of my second book, To Seduce a Nation. The reason I say that is because I was a missionary in the state of Alaska that year. 1973 was also the year that they announced they were going to build the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline. They also said that 25,000 pipeliners were going to converge on Alaska to build that pipeline. Well, what better opportunity for a missionary to witness than 25,000 pipeliners who are supposed to be the most wicked, cussingest, drinkingest folks on the face of the earth? So I went to the oil companies and I said, don't you need a chaplain on the pipeline? Well, they allowed me in the pipeline at work camps as a chaplain with no pay. Then about 6 months later, the oil company said, you chaplains are saving us thousands of dollars of counseling fees. We've decided to make life a little easier for you since we don't pay you anything. We've decided to give you executive status. I had not the slightest idea what that meant, but I was soon to find out that it meant I could go any place I wanted to, see anything I would like to see. Was even invited to sit in on board meetings with the oil company officials in an advisory capacity. I started seeing some things that didn't add up. You see, we all thought there was an energy crisis, didn't we? No, there wasn't. There was no gasoline shortage of any kind in the early 70s. The supposed or alleged gasoline shortage had been intentionally created in advance, not by the government nor by the oil companies. After all, I thought that too before I went to the pipeline. And I oftentimes state that if I had not lived my own story, I would have never believed it. I was seeing things so incredible until I decided someone more credible than I should see and hear what I was seeing. So I invited a senator from the state of Colorado to come to the pipeline. He did, spent a week with me, Senator Hugh Chance. He, by the way, writes the foreword to my first book, The Energy Non-Crisis. Senator Chance spent a week on the pipeline and was given a tour of the oil facility by a senior executive with Atlantic Richfield by the name of Mr. Ken Fromm. After that full day of briefing, questions, answers, rebuttal, Senator Chance, back in my dorm room that night, said, Lindsey, I can hardly believe what I've seen and heard today. And I said, Hugh, what do you mean? He said, Lindsey, only a few weeks ago, I was sitting in the Senate of the state of Colorado when the men came from the Department of Interior in Washington to brief us as state senators on the energy crisis. But he said, Lindsey, from what I have seen and heard here today, I have come to realize that almost everything I was told in that top-level federal briefing in the Senate of Colorado by the men from Washington was the exact opposite to what the truth really is. Undoubtedly, I was intentionally misbriefed. He later wrote the foreword to my book, The Energy Non-Crisis, stating that he had been intentionally lied to in a top-level federal briefing by men from Washington, D.C. That was the first indication I had that we're being controlled. There is an intentional misinformation that is being pumped to the American people by someone. There is a plot, if I may use the word. I don't like the word conspiracy necessarily, but I'll say there is a plot for the control of the people and the economy of the United States of America. I was shaken into reality from what happened with Senator Hugh Chance. After that, the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline was over 3 years later. I could not keep quiet with what I knew. I decided to author my first book, The Energy Non-Crisis. It soon put me on the road in speaking engagements all across America in lecture tour. And for the past 6 years, I've lectured nationwide. For instance, a year and a half ago, I was on the road for 7 months solid, averaged 2 speaking engagements per day. Traveling like this, I was able to learn additional things and publish my second book, To Seduce a Nation, which deals with the Constitution and how we are losing our constitutional rights. Then, it was time to tell, as Paul Harvey says, the rest of the story. After all, there is more to it than that. So the third book that just came out recently, entitled Syndrome of Control, there was something I learned on the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline. Because of my position as chaplain, I was expected to host or help to host dignitaries that came to the pipeline. It wasn't unusual for me to have breakfast with the Secretary-Treasurer of Exxon, to be with some congressman who was looking around the pipeline that morning, maybe that afternoon to be with some New York banker who was looking over the profits he might make from the pipeline. And I learned something from talking with these people. They don't think like we think. Their mindset, or as I sometimes call it, their mental plot, is different than what the average American thinks. They think in global terms. They think in power. They think in control. It really matters not to them for the dollar as much as it does the control factor. And what's happening to the American farmer today is that they are being intentionally controlled by a design plan, and their farms are being confiscated by a design plan that was initiated many, many years ago. America has been intentionally deindustrialized. They've moved our industry offshore. Then they're breaking the banking industry of America, or the banking institutions of America. Then the farmer, because whoever controls the food can ultimately control the people. Therefore, the farms of America must be confiscated. They must become corporate farms. They care not about the local farmer. After all, who cares about people from the top level? That's the direction that these people think in. They don't think in the same terms you and I think in. So, in my book, Syndrome of Control, I describe these people as the internationalist. There are many names that different people could put to them, but they are a group of people who hold the purse strings of the world. Now, they gain by every conflict that takes place in the world. For instance, #1 Red Square downtown Moscow is Chase Manhattan Bank. It's not there for the purpose of helping the Russian people. In fact, I understand that a Russian can't even have a checking account nor a savings account there. What's it there for? For the purpose of financing Russia's war machine. They finance Russia's war machine. They finance America's private enterprise that builds America's war machine. Every time our president goes to a summit conference and comes back and says negotiations broke down, they love it. Russia borrows more money from them, America borrows more money from them. They finance both sides of every war. They have everything to gain by it. They have everything to gain by breaking the American farmer, by breaking America's airlines, by breaking the American privately owned bank. Let's take an illustration of this. If the local bank goes under, that bank is a privately owned institution. It is a stock holding company. Most of your local private banks are. Whenever that bank goes under, remember that the FDIC or the FSLIC guarantee the money that's in those banks. Now, who is the FDIC and the FSLIC? Let's take those letters and examine them one by one. First of all, the letter F stands for federal. Well, are they really federal? Is Federal Express federal? D, deposit. Do they really have enough money on deposit to cover the money that's in that bank? Insurance. Is it really an insurance? And the last letter is the best of all, F-D-I-C. C stands for corporation. Well, is a corporation a federal agency? No. Corporation has stockholders. It's chartered by either the federal or the state. Then who really owns the FDIC? Dig into the ownership of the FDIC, also of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is owned by those who own the majority of the stock in the local Federal Reserve regional banks. Is the Federal Reserve an agency of the federal government? Well, what does the FDIC or the FSLIC have to gain by a local bank closing? Everything. After all, when a corporation or a company declares bankruptcy, the stockholders lose everything. The owners are changed. Who gets the bank free of charge, doesn't pay a penny for it? All of its assets, pays nothing for it? And who can call the loans within X number of days that are outstanding with that bank? And the farmers are required to pay. And if they can't pay, who confiscates the land? You see, it's to their advantage to break the banking industry of America. It's to their advantage to deindustrialize America. It was likewise to their advantage to break South Africa. Do you really think that race is the issue in South Africa? Remember that South Africa was the only completely self-supporting, self-sufficient, free enterprise Christian nation in Africa. Do you make any money off of a nation like that? No, a nation like that doesn't have to borrow anything from you. So what do? You have to break them so that you can put them under interest or usury. So what did they do? They broke the economy of South Africa. So in turn, South Africa has to bow their knee at the hand of the international bankers to say, we need money. What do the international bankers charge them? Interest. Now they have them where they want them. They make money off of them. What did they do to the American farmer? The identical same thing. As a farmer said to me the other day, this farm has been in our family for 3 generations, farmed profitably. We had no problem operating year by year. But then, back in the 70s, all of a sudden something called inflation. And oh, by the way, who creates inflation? Well, who creates the price of money, so to speak? Who determines interest? Who determines the American dollar in relation to foreign currencies? Isn't it all determined by the Federal Reserve? Who is the Federal Reserve? We've just discussed it. So now let's go back to what they did to the farmer. In the 70s, interest rates started going up. Inflation went berserk. The farmer just started paying more interest than what he could possibly make on the products on his farm. So the farmer became more heavier and heavier and heavier in debt. Then, as one farmer said, the price of corn 3 years ago was $3 a bushel. Last year, it was $2.75 a bushel. Now they said corn has gone down to only $1.75 a bushel. Next year, it's expected to be lower. Who determined the price of the product? Did the farmer? Then did he have anything to do with his going broke? Who determined the interest that the farmer was paying at the bank? Did the farmer? He had nothing to do with it. Interest went from 3 to 4% up to 12 and 15% in just a matter of a very few years. Did the farmer have anything to do with that? How can we blame the farmer for what someone else did to him? Is the farmer broke because he determined in his mind he wanted to go broke? Or because he was a bad manager? After all, he doesn't determine the price of his corn or his wheat. That's determined by the people who broker it worldwide. Who determined the price of the interest? The Federal Reserve. To whose advantage is it to break the farmer? Now remember, whenever the farmer goes broke, his loans are turned back to the local bank. Then when the local bank goes broke, who gets all of the land? The FDIC or the FSLIC. Who are the owners? You see, we have to go a lot further back than just the local bank. Let's go to the Arabs, for instance. OPEC has nothing to do with the price of oil whatsoever. Remember that 35 to 40 years ago, the people who are today Arab sheiks were nothing but nomads roaming the deserts riding camels. How much did they know about international finance? Well, international bankers found oil on their property, decided that they would build their oil fields. But what do they charge whenever they build Arab oil fields? They charge interest, don't they? Well, they did, and made the Arabs. Then all of a sudden, oil prices go down to $10 a barrel, as low as $9 a barrel. Who did it? Does OPEC really control the price of oil? Quite to the contrary. We find out that Saudi Arabia just fired their oil minister. They said he can't maintain the price of oil anymore. Well, I guess he can't. He doesn't have enough control with where the purchase centers of the world are. Remember that the price of oil is controlled by the people who sit at the computers and purchase the tankers of oil every day. They take the price of that oil anywhere they want to. So they made the Arabs. Then they told the Arabs where they should invest. Where? In American Treasury bills, gold and silver, long-term securities. Then they make them rich. They've invested all of this, but how much was gold back in the days when the Arabs were investing? Well, gold went to $700 and $800 an ounce, didn't they? They bought it by the carload. Then oil goes to $9 a barrel. Well, what do they do in order to maintain their economy? They have to cash in some securities, don't they? Can't cash in Treasury bills. America doesn't have the money to pay them. Can't cash in long-term securities, there are dates on them. What do they cash in? But how much do they sell that gold back for? They bought it for $800 an ounce. What are they selling it back to the same people they bought it from? How much are they selling it for? $370, $400 an ounce? You see, they make them, then they break them. They make money on both sides. They made money when they made them. They made money when they break them. And who controls the price of their oil? Not OPEC, but the people who purchase that oil. Who are they? The internationalists, the international financiers. Now, they did the identical same thing to the American farmer. Remember, there was a time when the farmer was making money. He was his own person. He could stand strong and proud and say, I'm glad to be a free enterprise farmer in America. And I'm supplying the world from the breadbasket of the world. Back in those days, the farmer didn't have to borrow much from the banks, if anything at all. Then what happened? Land prices started going up. They said, buy more land. Inflation went sky high. But who controls inflation? The identical same people that control the Federal Reserve and the American dollar. They took inflation to where they wanted it. The farmer was told to buy more, get deeper in. He did. After all, why shouldn't the banker advise him right? He'd always been his friend up until this point. Then the identical same people who caused that inflation brought about deflation and deindustrialization of America, and taking the American dollar sky high on the world market in relation to other currencies. What did that do to the farmer? As one farmer said to me the other day, my land values were up to $3,000 an acre back 5 years ago. Now they're down to $700 an acre. Who broke them? The same people that made them. Who took the price of land to $700 an acre? The same people who took it to $3,000 an acre. The manipulators worldwide of finance, the power brokers, the internationalists, if I may, as I described them in my book, Syndrome of Control. So what happens to the farmer? All they have to do is bring about deflation. The farmer now is paying 12 to 15% interest and he can't pay off his loan. He doesn't have enough collateral. Whose fault was it that the farmer is losing the farm? Is it his fault? Quite to the contrary. It's the fault of the people who brought about the inflation and then the deflation to intentionally take away the farmer's farm, because when you control food, you control the people of a nation. It's not the fault of the farmer that he's losing his farm. It's the fault of the people who intentionally, by design plan, are stealing the farms of America for the purpose of being able to control the food and the people and the farmers.